Well, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Bill Sanders, the Dean of the College of Engineering. I appreciate this opportunity to speak with you for a moment before I introduce our guest speaker. As you all know, it's no longer business as usual. This is a time in the pandemic that calls for quick responses and quick actions on so many fronts. I can tell you what I've seen clearly shining through these circumstances is a commitment we have in the college to the important mission of research and education. For some people, we were able to stand up entirely new research efforts at warp speed, while others leveraged AI and predictive analytics to unearth smarter and more sustainable ways to operate and combat the public health crisis. Our engineering college researchers are working across the full spectrum of COVID-19 to understand, detect, treat, and prevent the virus. The research talents of our faculty are delving into understanding the spread of the virus and the immune response, tests for rapid detection and diagnosis, medication delivery, and many more initiatives. So we're here today to focus specifically on the sustainability aspects of the pandemic. In engineering, we have related research activities underway in sustaining and energy impacts, including clean air and pollution, as well as examining amplifying inequalities that include access to electricity, food, delivery, and other infrastructure services as some examples of such inequalities. I'm excited about the session today and to take a deeper look at the ways to improve sustainability and equity. In closing, I want to acknowledge that the road ahead will certainly have challenges. But that said, there's also tremendous amount of hope because of the doors that academic research can open in such a time. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Marcia McNutt. She is a geophysicist and the 22nd president of the National Academy of Sciences. From 2013 to 2016, she was editor-in-chief of Science Journal. Prior to that role, she was the director of the U.S. Geological Survey from 2009 to 2013, during which time there were a number of major disasters, including the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, for which Marcia was awarded the U.S. Coast Guard's Merit Service Medal. Prior to serving as the director of USGA, she was the president and CEO of the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. And prior to that, she rose through the academic ranks of the Department of Earth, Atmospheric, and Planetary Sciences at MIT. In 1998, Marcia was awarded the Early Career Medal for Research and Accomplishments from the American Geophysical Union in recognition of her significant contributions to Earth and space science. And she received the AGU Ewing Medal in 2007 for her contributions to deep sea exploration. I would now like to welcome Marcia and thank her for being with us here today.
Very much, Dean Sanders, for that fabulous introduction. It is definitely my pleasure to be speaking here today to CMU, a great university. I have to say that putting together today's presentation was actually a lot of fun for me because of the fact that it allowed me to think really deeply about COVID-19 as a great impact and accelerator for sustainability. And when I first put this talk together, I actually thought about grading the various sustainability goals in terms of how we were doing in terms of advancing them, giving A's, B's, C's, D's. But as my former students at MIT will tell you, I was a very, very tough grader. And I was worried that if I actually went to grades, there would be too much discouragement because of all the poor grades that you would be seeing. So instead, I decided I would just talk about winners and losers. So if I could have the next slide, please. I think that most of you are familiar with the UN sustainability goals. There are 17 of them here, including partnerships for the goals, but 16 major topics that people all over the world, scientists and non-scientists alike, are trying to make progress on. And I'm not going to cover all of them, but I took an important subset of them that I felt had been strongly impacted by COVID. So if I could have the next slide, please. Let's start with the most obvious. Goal number 3, good health and well-being. Well, when we talk about winners and losers, this is a clear loser. You can't have a pandemic and expect that we're going to come out winners. The plot on the right shows numbers of new cases of coronavirus in the United States, starting in January and going on through just a few days ago in September by day. And you can see that, the large numbers of people, as many as almost 100,000 people a day, that were being sickened by the virus. So this is an area where we have clearly lost ground in terms of national and global health and well-being. But the only slight silver lining in this is lower rates of transmission of other communicable diseases thanks to social distancing. Just speaking for myself, because I have been isolated on this mountaintop where I am right now in coastal California, I haven't had a sniffle since February. And so, and I know that flu rates and other rates of other communicable diseases are also down because of the social isolation. Okay, if I could have the next slide. Okay, another clear loser is the topic of decent work and economic growth. The plot on the right here shows unemployment rates that, of course, took a huge swing upward in March as the nation shut down. And this is just new people being added to the unemployment rolls. And so, of course, these numbers are cumulative. And it's difficult for any economy to expand during a shutdown. So this is another area in the sustainability domain where it's very difficult to make progress during a pandemic. If I could have the next slide, please. Now, climate action. This is an area where we actually have seen that the pandemic has had opportunities to advance sustainability. I think it's an area where we've had progress both in the short term and in the long term. The plot on the right shows estimated daily carbon emissions in 2020, and it shows that both the plot with the range of uncertainty, how carbon emissions have dropped for a number of reasons. First of all, during a shutdown, people aren't driving their cars, but they also aren't using air transportation, and people are not heating offices as well as their homes. So buildings are being used more efficiently. And I think that even in the long term, people are unlikely to go back to the way it was before. Many people who had long commutes are much more likely to be telecommuting to their jobs. And so this could be an area of long-term gain in terms of carbon emissions. If I could have the next slide, please. Life on land. This is another area where we have at least seen some short-term gains. This is an elephant, in a Thai forest, which is just kind of lumbering down the road. And these elephants were actually pushed to the brink of extinction in this area and have now been making a relative comeback because of the lack of people. And I know that many of you can recall seeing pictures and stories in all of your local newspapers about how many animals have sort of regained their former territory when people were locked indoors. I'm not exactly expecting that these gains will last, but this could be an opportunity for people to reconsider how they can share space with nature. If I could have the next slide. Now, there are many of the sustainability goals which are more nuanced. Let's talk about quality education. I think that many students, particularly in the K through 12 arena, are losing in the short term. In the spring of 2020, many schools struggled to put learning online, and many parents struggled to enable their students to take advantage of what online learning there was. We saw a huge divide between the haves and the have-nots of students who had access to high bandwidth and who had access to computers so that they could take advantage of online learning, and those who didn't, and so who were left behind. There were high rates of dropouts of students in college who were unable to take advantage of distance learning. And many of these were students from underrepresented groups who, even though they had scholarships, had to forego them because they couldn't take advantage of online learning. We've seen that requests and applications for scholarships are actually down for the fall of 2020 because students are unable to take advantage of online learning. But in the long term, we actually could find that education wins. And we could find that it's a winner if we solve the problem of making education accessible for all. And that will take a very dedicated dedication from all at the federal, at the state, at the local level. But if we figure out how to make education more egalitarian and more accessible, then people of all economic backgrounds and of all races could actually benefit. And even college won't be just for a few scholarship students and for the wealthy, but it could be available to a much wider group of students. If I could have the next slide. Industrial innovation and infrastructure. Well, I think that we've probably seen in areas of developing solutions to COVID, therapies for the sick and immunizations, there has been rapid innovation in some fields of biology. But I very much worry that this pandemic is going to delay innovation in other fields. This little graphic on the right shows some of the impact on university research of the pandemic. For example, 77% of life science institutes were shut down at some point. 57% of scientists lost up to 6 months of work. 66% used extra time for some sort of career development because they weren't in the lab. 30% attended virtual conferences rather than being able to attend in person. 26% fear additional costs due to lost work, and 18% take part in COVID-19 related research, which is less than a fifth of the workforce. So clearly there has been a big impact on our research innovation pipeline for all fields outside of COVID-19 work. So this is going to have a long tail as we try to ramp up our innovation infrastructure and our innovation pipeline. If I could have the next slide, please. Gender equality. This is an area where we've been really concerned about the impacts at the National Academy. I think there could be bad news in the short term, but maybe good news in the long term. This advertisement for a report on the right has shown that COVID-19 has disproportionately impacted women's health, their work, and their financial security. Women, unfortunately, are still bearing the brunt of taking care of young children and elderly parents in the home while they're still trying to do their jobs through telecommuting. And it's been very difficult for women to bear the burden of caring for relatives while still trying to get their jobs done. At the academies, we are doing a study right now on the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on women, which we hope to deliver soon. However, I think I'm a little bit more optimistic about the long-term impact of what we're seeing the trends in from COVID in the long term, because if the result is much more flexibility in telework and much more locational flexibility in where women do their work, that could actually benefit them. It can benefit two-career couples because women would not be tied to having to take a job where their husband's job is, and they could have more flexible work hours to accommodate young children, preschool children, and children's school hours. So in the end, this might actually be an advantage. If I could have the next slide. Reducing inequalities. Well, we've seen that this is, COVID has only accentuated and brought to the forefront some of the inequalities. This plot shows the proportion of various underrepresented minorities in the population versus the impact of COVID on them. So for example, you can see that in Hispanic Latinos, while they are 18% of the population, they are 34% of those affected by COVID. Black African Americans are 13% of the population, but 21% of those affected by COVID. So clearly, they are being disproportionately affected by this pandemic. But of course, we've seen that while looking at the disproportionate effect of COVID, it's not only in their health, but we've also seen that it's affecting, that there are long-standing inequalities in income, in opportunities, in justice. And I think if anything, COVID and the other issues that have made the headlines, such as the brutal police actions, hopefully this will lead to more demands for equality. Okay, if I could have the next slide. All right, no poverty. This is one of the goals. Predictions are that poverty will increase. This diagram on the right is a prediction I haven't seen actual data, but this is a prediction that COVID-19 could push 500 million people in the planet into poverty. And it's because of a 20% income drop. The area most likely to be impacted is East Asia and the Pacific, but you can see that no part of the globe is going to be spared. So this is likely to increase inequality while increasing the overall levels of poverty. And this is very disconcerting because we have seen gains in terms of, in these very areas of the globe, of large numbers of the population being lifted out of poverty. And now we see that this could reverse a lot of those recent gains. If I could have the next slide. Sustainable cities and communities. Now, this topic has gotten less attention than other ones, but the reason why I raise it here is mostly because of trends I'm seeing here in the United States. There is a real estate boom happening in places like Cape Cod, South Lake Tahoe, and other areas that are outside of major cities as people want space, they want to get out of crowded cities, they want a place where they can stretch out during these periods of lockdowns and have room to expand without coming into contact with potentially infected people. The experience of people living in New York City has scared a lot of urban dwellers, and so they want location independence, cutting ties with the city. There's a premium on outdoor space. They want someplace where they can live, work, and play at home. And so there's a premium placed on compounds that are outside of the city. I think that this is an unfortunate trend because this style of living is less sustainable. Cities are more efficient in terms of providing services such as water, electricity, sewage, treatment, etc. And while, of course, I'm hoping these people will all telecommute and not be using fossil fuels to travel, they're still further from services, further from grocery stores and entertainment, etc. So if this trend continues after COVID, I think it could reverse sustainability in terms of sustainable communities. If I could have the next slide, please. I've lumped together life below the water and responsible consumption and pollution or production because of the fact that we're seeing a huge increase in waste in plastic in the ocean and in the environment due to COVID. These are from two primary sources. One is waste from medical environment, all the personal protective equipment that is required to keep health workers and visitors to those in COVID wings safe, face masks, plastic shields, plastic gloves, and then also all the takeout containers because we're not allowed to eat in most restaurants. And all of this plastic waste is littering the environment and building up in the ocean. So this is reversing what had been some positive trends in containing the amount of plastic waste that was going into the environment. I'm hoping that this is a short-term trend, but I think we need to think seriously about how we can find alternatives to all this plastic waste in case of future pandemics. If I could have the next slide, please. Okay, so seeing these trends now, what can be done to change the longer term outcome? Well, I'm just throwing out a few ideas here. We need to encourage that telework become more permanent and virtual meeting practices become more permanent. Certainly, we need to invest in public health. We've seen that those who are suffering most from the pandemic are those who are obese and have pre-existing conditions like lung problems. Investing both personally and at a national level in public health can definitely pay off for this pandemic and in future ones. And then we need to ask ourselves, what innovations could be developed to prevent a repeat of these setbacks in sustainability in the future? Well, as I just suggested, developing reusable personal protective equipment so that we aren't discarding all of this plastic in the ocean and in the environment. Require use of biodegradable takeout containers rather than plastic, which lasts forever. And implement a nationwide high-speed wireless and other programs to lower the technology gap. I think one of the most important things that we could do right now would be to take a page out of Eisenhower's book, where he created the interstate highway system, and say that a modern day equivalent of that would be a nationwide high-speed wireless system that would lower the technology gap between the haves and have-nots and allow everyone on the information superhighway that would bring education and information to everyone. So if I could have the last slide, please. The pandemic can be a catalyst for change, but we need to make sure it's a change for the better so that all of these sustainability goals are winners and not losers. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion as to how we can turn a lot of these negatives into positives. The pandemic has definitely disrupted so many parts of our lives. Let's make sure we use these disruptions as change for the better. So thank you very much.
And thank you, Marcia. My name is Jason Maderer. I work at Carnegie Mellon in communications. And for the next 15 or 20 minutes or so, we're going to have some Q&A. Let you get a drink of water if you need to, Marcia. I'll kind of stall this out a little bit. Those who are watching, we're going to ask some of your questions. Please go ahead and fill in your questions at the bottom of the screen. We will get them on our end and be sure to put it to Dr. McNutt. Let's start with this. You have positivity about how things can change. Let's go kind of a big picture. I know there were some trends in there. Society as a whole, are there 2 or 3 things, and you could take whichever of the 17 SDGs that you want, that are number 1 or number 2 important that we got to get to sooner rather than later?
So I think that, let me just give you one example. I think that people had been looking at the steady, almost uninterrupted climb in CO2 emissions and despaired. And yet we've seen with COVID that we can lower CO2, and actually people are happy about it. My whole staff at the National Academy is really happy that they can work at home more often. And all of our volunteers that staff our panels and committees and consensus report groups, they also are happy that they aren't traveling on airplanes all the time. So I think we will never go back to the way we used to be. We will probably get together sometimes because we have to do some things in person, but we will never go back to the CO2 levels of consumption that we were at before. But it takes a big disruption like COVID to show us that there is a way forward that we can do and it works. So I think that using that kind of argument, we can take a big disruption like COVID and we can also tackle the waste problem. I think this is within our reach. It doesn't have to be rocket science to deal with the waste problem. We just have to put our mind to it and say, this is unacceptable, and we are going to solve it.
What about from a personal standpoint? Myself, the person right down the street, what can you do on a personal level to attack this?
Yes. So let me just talk about what I've been doing personally. I know that my grocery store does not allow me to bring my bags in because of COVID contamination. And so they've gone back to supplying their bags, which of course adds to the waste. You can choose paper, which of course is probably environmentally a better choice than plastic. But what I just do is I say to the checkout person, just put all my items back in the cart. I take the cart out to my car. I put them all in my reusable bags. I bring the cart back to the store. The checkout people love it. It's so much easier to put everything back in the cart than for them to have to bag it. I don't have any waste, extra waste that I have to bring back. And everyone wins. So there are simple little things we can do like that that help the environment, help the establishment, and that make us feel good that we're doing everything we can to reduce waste.
From a mindset perspective, do you think society having to take collective action against COVID will actually help change a mindset towards sustainability as a whole?
Yes, though I think I worry that time may be limited. The wonderful thing about a disaster like COVID, or as Dean Sanders mentioned, I worked on Deepwater Horizon. The advantage of a crisis is that everyone is willing to put aside petty differences or small changes in philosophy to work together toward a greater good. And then once the crisis is over, then suddenly people start caring again about, oh, who's going to get credit for this? Or who's going to benefit from it? Who's going to be the one who makes money off it or whatever? During the crisis, all of that is put aside because everyone has the big issue in mind. We've got to get through this crisis. And so I think we have to act swiftly while everyone has their eye on the ball. We've got to conquer COVID without destroying the planet. So I think time is not on our side. We've got to take advantage of this crisis.
You talked about working from home or traveling differently, CO2 levels. What other things do you think are going to stick when this new normal becomes whatever normal is? What other things do you think long-term are going to be a positive result of what we're enduring now, if enduring is the right word?
Yeah, so a couple things. One thing I think will, a couple sort of natural analogy, well, a natural sort of downstream effects will be, just speaking personally, I look at what I've spent on personal items like clothes. It's gone to about zero because I'm not going anyplace. So I think that that people will probably find that they're spending more time doing fun things with their families and spending less on worrying about how they look, because if people aren't having to dress up to go to work every day and instead dressing down to play with the kids out in the yard, that's definitely a different priority. I think that people will probably, once they can get back together with friends and neighbors again, that is going to be such a thrill for people that I don't know if we'll ever take it for granted again, at least not for a very long time. So those are a few things.
Good. Please continue to send in questions if you're watching down to the bottom of your screen. We're continuing to ask some of those with Marcia McNutt, who is the president of the National Academy of Sciences. Dr. McNutt, how about the pandemic's different effects on different communities? How is it exposed, or if it's exposed, deeper societal issues related to environmental health and also inequity?
It absolutely has exposed these inequalities. We have seen that the pandemic is much more difficult on people with pre-existing lung conditions. People who have trouble breathing are much more likely to end up on a respirator. And as you know, if you end up on a respirator, your chances of dying are much, much higher. And people with pre-existing lung conditions are communities which are have been subjected to poor air quality, and these are communities that are much more likely to be minority communities, much more likely to have been subjected to less attention to the air quality standards, to enforcement of Clean Air Act, and just as an example, I saw a community near me the other day that stood up against a utility that wanted to put in their backyard a major industrial complex that was going to benefit not that community, but other wealthy communities around them. And, I think it's wonderful that they did that, but you think of how many times in the past they haven't had the voice or the political clout to do it. And because right now people are recognizing that these communities have been disproportionately penalized with industrial pollution because they haven't had the voice. I was very happy to see that politicians stood up for them and said, no, you don't have to bear the brunt of pollution for other groups.
Are we yet to the point in this pandemic where you can start to look forward to what we've already learned and apply it to the next pandemic? Or are you still so focused, and rightly so, on what we do in the next 2 years, 3 years, next 6 months?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So certainly we haven't yet had a full lessons learned, but I think there are a couple things that are now really obvious. One of them is any investment in public health is going to be a robust strategy in community resilience. That if your population has a strong underlying basis of good health to begin with, you will come through the pandemic much better than if you have a lot of pre-existing conditions. In this country, we have a very bad record on that front. We tend to put a lot of money into addressing the disease du jour rather than worrying about raising up the base level of health of everyone. So obesity is rampant in the US. Heart disease is rampant in the US. High blood pressure is rampant in the US. And these are all conditions that can be avoided and addressed if we would just put our efforts into that rather than the immense money we spend at end of life addressing people in their last weeks of life. Huge amounts of money spent then. So I think that's one lesson. Another lesson we've learned, and I think we kind of knew this all along, is if you look at the important science that has allowed the US, the UK, China, and other nations to rapidly develop a vaccine, many vaccines, in record time compared to any previous, even the ones that have been in modern history. It was all based on basic science discoveries that have happened in the last decade. And none of them were actually targeted towards vaccine development. It was all basic science that was done without an idea that this would be for a pandemic. And so it shows that federal investment in basic research has benefits that we definitely reap in times of crisis. So I think those are two very strong lessons. I think the third lesson that I just have to put out on the table is if we look internationally at those nations that have done well in this crisis and those that haven't, is science has made a difference. And when the leadership of the nations have listened to their scientists, and when they have encouraged their population to follow the recommendations of science, then it has mattered in terms of the infection rate and the death rate. When the leadership has ignored science and actually made recommendations that have run counter to the recommendations of scientists, then it has been to the disadvantage of the health of the population.
This is probably then a segue into a question that I knew would get asked, and here it is. What are your thoughts on how COVID has affected the public perception of science? And I know that what you just spoke is often tied to how the public perceives science, but I was curious, especially in your world at the National Academy of Sciences, your opinion on this.
Well, I always have a hard time answering the question of how the public perceives, because it almost makes it sound as though there is a public that one could go talk to, and the public would answer your question and you would get a good sense of what the public thinks.
The public
Because
as a
yes, as we know, there are different viewpoints, and numerous polls have shown that there's quite a divisive or quite disparate viewpoints depending on who you ask. And unfortunately, it has become politicized recently, which is too bad, because I don't remember a previous time, at least recently, where a public health issue has become a political issue. Usually, in most of my time as a scientist, public health and the health advice has been strongly supported on both sides of the aisle, that everyone has agreed that science is important to health, and that no matter what someone's political persuasion has been, they have been strongly supporting science for the sake of health. And now we see everything from people in strongly conservative communities questioning whether there even is a pandemic and whether it is fake news, to people in very liberal communities despairing that science is not playing a larger role in our response to the pandemic.
How do you think this dynamic affects sustainability going forward?
So I think that unless we can come to a stronger agreement that science leads the way, it's going to be very difficult to achieve any of the sustainability goals, honestly.
Let us, with our 5 minutes left, let us make a deviation back to the positive. You talked about some of the winners, some of the losers. We'll focus on, when you look at the SDGs, the opportunity, as you said, of taking a pandemic and rethinking things that otherwise seemed as impossible obstacles prior. What makes you most positive these days?
Yeah. So, as I said, I'm positive for climate. I'm positive for women's equity issues. I'm positive that we can rethink education and do much better in that regard. I'm positive that we might be able to reduce inequalities because of changes we'll make that, imagine that we have the infrastructure and the access in this country that your ability to do a job does not depend on where you live. That you can do a job from anywhere. You can do it from the middle of Kansas or North Dakota or anywhere, because you have access to a good education, you have access to good communications infrastructure, and you have all the other essential ingredients to make you part of modern society. Anything that erases what I see as disadvantages to people from disadvantaged communities or parts of the country that feel that they've been left behind, I think is going to be important ways forward. And I think this pandemic is showing us the way forward.
I also must imagine.
Encouraged.
Go ahead. I also must imagine. You must be encouraged also. I mean, if you take a look at, when you started your career as a geophysicist, just the fact that there are 17 goals about sustainability these days. It is top of mind for so many others. I imagine you've kind of seen this wave of support for something that obviously holds so dear to you.
Let me give you an example. At the last annual meeting of the National Academy, we put out a challenge to all 6 classes in the National Academies: physical sciences, biological sciences, medical sciences, engineering sciences, environmental sciences, etc., all 6 classes, for them to come forward with a representative from each class on what they felt would be a candidate for a grand challenge that the Academy should take on. 3 of the classes independently framed their challenge around the Sustainable Development Goals independently. That just shows how much the SDGs have permeated thinking across all of the sciences.
Is that something that you've seen transpire over, the last several months, or you've seen this coming over the last several years?
Last several years, they've really caught on. They've caught fire. Everyone thinks these are a framing that takes all of the different science we do and raises it to a level of contributing to society, which makes us all proud for how we can contribute to the continuation of humans on this planet in a way that we can tell our grandchildren we were part of making that happen.
Fantastic. Dr. Marcia McNutt, the 22nd President of the National Academy of Sciences, we really appreciate it. On behalf of Carnegie Mellon, we're grateful for your words this afternoon. We appreciate it.
Thanks very much, Jason. This was fun.
You got it. All right. That wraps up the keynote. We have just a bit more to go, and for that, we turn it over to Mr. Philip Lehman from our School of Computer Science at Carnegie Mellon to take us home the rest of the way. Philip?
Well, thank you again, Dr. McNutt. We so appreciate your insights and perspective, and your framing the challenges and opportunities ahead for all of us. Speaking for myself, I especially appreciate your notes of optimism. And thank you to Jason for moderating, and to our earlier panelists for the lively discussion. I do want to remind everyone to join us again next week when we'll be covering COVID and the economy, and we'll end on COVID and education 2 weeks from today on October 2nd. I also encourage you again to visit the resources page on the platform website for demos and sponsor booths. And starting in a few minutes, there'll be networking opportunities there, including with some of our panelists and moderators. That'll last for the next hour. From all of us at Carnegie Mellon, thank you all again for joining us, and we'll see you next week.